to do is tell you a little bit about something. We know a lot about the people that played around here. We got lots of history of the music and how it was played and people who played. We don't know a lot about how the instruments were made, and I think that's something we're kind of missing. So we're just going to give you a little snippet of what happened here about instruments. And basically, it came from families that moved into the area that had music as part of their family and different instruments. Just as an example, to give you some context, Crooked Creek, just north of here, just north of Galax. Galax is a new invention. Galax came around 1910, a little before 1910, before we even had Galax. But the community just north of here, which was originally Grayson County and part of Wythe County, along Crooked Creek, families started moving in around the late 1700s. By the early 1800s, the families along Crooked Creek, the Lundys, the Meltons, the Frosts, the Stonemans, and the ones I came from, the Landreths, were right down Crooked Creek. So not only did they come with music in their families, they also came with some sort of music building tradition, and they all intermarried. So even if they weren't strong music families, it didn't take long. By the mid-1800s, with the intermarriage and the groups along the new settlements along the creek, everybody had a family that played music, and all of them built instruments because they didn't have instruments, and there wasn't a catalog you could order them from. So every family, turns out, built instruments. And it's surprising when you start looking how many of the families have instrument makers in the family. And that wasn't, when I started looking at that, I didn't expect that. I didn't even know there was anybody in my family that made instruments. But they all made their own instruments. And that tradition of making your own instruments continues through today. So the people like the ones on the wall here, Wayne Henderson, Jimmy Edmonds, who else is up here, Mary Ann? Tim Donnelly, all are local current instrument makers that have a tradition of building instruments, but it's not new. That was a tradition that was from around here. It came from the fact that they played music, they didn't have any place to get their instruments, and they made their own, and there was a lot of wood here. Everything around Galax was related to wood. The furniture factories, the instruments, everything. There was a wonderful supply of wood, and almost all the instruments you're going to see here were made with local wood. So I think we'll start with dulcimers. Phyllis Gaskins is one of the few people who actually learned from some of the local dulcimer players, learned the style, learned about the instruments and about who made them, and knows about the construction. And Galax has a completely unique dulcimer style and dulcimer construction. So if she's going to tell you a little bit about Galax style dulcimers.
Right, and in order to do that, I need to preface that with what the Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina dulcimers were like. They were hourglass shaped, they were teardrop shaped, and they were much smaller instruments. They were about this thick, had a very soft, dulcet tone to them, and could not be heard if they were played with another instrument. Beautiful instruments. This instrument is also a beautiful instrument, but some of these dulcimers were that thick, and some of them were this thick. They were monster dulcimers. They were a lot longer. These dulcimers were played in string bands, and they could compete with banjo and fiddle. The reason it's called a Galax dulcimer is because at the very first Fiddlers Convention that was ever held, the dulcimer players were Meltons, and the Meltons took all of the places. First, second, third, I think, was all that was offered then. And for every dulcimer contest up until they were stopped, and then they were restarted in 1974. In 1974, it was still a member of the Melton family that won the contest. There were 5 prizes that year. And although their names were not all Melton, they were all part of the Melton family. What happened was all the other dulcimer players started calling this the Galax dulcimer because it's the dulcimer that won the Galax Fiddlers contest. And that's how it got its name, the Galax dulcimer. It's featured in this little book over here by Ralph Lee Smith. There's 2 pictures in there. One of them is of a Raymond Melton dulcimer, and one of them is of a Roscoe Russell dulcimer. And I have both of those kinds here on my lap. The North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky dulcimers became popular because of a lady named Jean Ritchie, who took the instrument up to New York, to Greenwich Village, in the folk era, the 1960s. And all the folkies latched on to playing that, and it turns out that there were folk schools down in those states that just churned these instruments out. And so they were carried all over the United States. This particular dulcimer didn't have anything like that happening for it. There was no workshop where these things were made, and they just kept making them and making them. It came from one family. Around the 1850s, some Mr. Melton, started making these instruments, and it continued in the Melton family all the way up until the 1990s within that family. The tuning is different, and that's one of the first things you notice about this dulcimer, is that all the strings are the same. There is no wound string, there is no middle tone string. They are all D, right beside a middle C. That's one of the things that's different. Another thing that's different is that the head, the fretboard, and the tailpiece are not separate pieces of wood. They are all the same piece of wood. It's like they took a 2x4, cut the middle out of it, hollowed it out, drilled holes in the top for the fretboard, and then built the body of the instrument around that particular shape. What I have, one of the things that I put in the book that I did was that particular shape that one of the Meltons drew for me, was this shape right here, where you have, this is the head, this is the block, there's the piece of wood, and then this is a tail piece. All of the old Virginia dulcimers had a D shape here, all of the old makers. And there were numerous Virginia styles. This particular one came out of the Melton family. But there were other Virginia ones, and they were all shaped in a bow. There were no hourglass ones. They were bow-shaped, and they had a D handle on them right there. This particular Melton one also had a false bottom. Can you see this? That made it louder, because if you set an instrument down on your lap and you strum it, your lap dampens the tone. With this false bottom, the tone was not dampened, and it made a really big, a really loud tone. The frets on the old dulcimers are staple frets. Raymond told me that he used women's steel hairpins and shaped them in the shape of staples and put them into his dulcimer as staples. He made this brown one for me that's on my lap, and it had staple frets in it when I got it, and I wore them out, and very stupidly had somebody refret it for me the modern way, and so that's why my frets go all the way across. But this one was made by Jacob Ray Melton, and Jacob Ray was Raymond Melton's nephew, and he made this one in 1992 for me in the old style. They would have painted their dulcimers with a dark stain, and in fact, Raymond had one in his family that had belonged to his mother, and it was painted black. It was a wedding gift for him. Lost my paper, and I lost my train of thought. Okay, all the strings tuned the same. They had a double bottom. They had a one-piece head, fretboard, tailpiece combo. They had a D-shaped tailpiece, and they had frets under the first 2 strings. Now, the thing that was interesting to me was that when I first started playing one of these dulcimers, other dulcimer players were saying, "Why don't you get yourself a real dulcimer?" And I said to them, "This is a real dulcimer. You just don't know it yet." Because I was a little cocky, and I really wanted to do what I wanted to do. And indeed, a few years ago, I did find out that it is one of the first true dulcimers. The old German Scheitholz and the old German Hummels are the main ancestor of these dulcimers. And a few years ago, I met a German luthier who had a Hummel, and I purchased it from him. And the interesting thing about that Hummel was that all of the first 4 strings were those 4 strings right there. And that's where the Meltons got this tuning. They didn't make it up. They took it from that old instrument. It's right there. The other 4 strings that were on that instrument were a chord, which is what regular dulcimers have on them. Their tuning is D-A-D or D-A-A, and it sounds a chord when you strum across it. And so the other dulcimer makers obviously took that idea to build their instruments, whereas the Meltons took this idea and built their instruments.
Phyllis, do we have any idea how they got that idea? Because the Melton family is basically an English family, so they didn't have a German heritage.
Nope. They did not have a German heritage, but Germans came down the wagon road, and they brought with them the German Scheitholz. The last German Scheitholz maker in Virginia lived up close to where I live. And there were other instruments found up in that area. But, you know, the cultures moved. They shifted.
Well, it's one of the interesting things, and maybe everyone here knows, but one of the interesting things to me in looking at Appalachian culture is that you had Germans moving down the wagon road, you had English moving in from the coast,
right.
And they kind of got to here and they all mixed.
They mixed together.
And that's where the culture got really interesting. Mm-hmm. So I guess our best guess would be that some of the English who were moving in, like the Meltons, ran into these Germans who were playing the Scheinholz.
So that's a really cool instrument, but it would be better if.
It's a really cool instrument, but I can. That's the Southwest Virginia way. Okay, but I can do this better.
Yeah, and this was just right for string band music. It's very loud.
Well, and that's another thing that I think want to make sure everybody understands is that one of the things I learned from Phyllis is that I thought of dulcimers like the North Carolina dulcimer that you sat and went twang, 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 and that was all you did. What I found out from Phyllis was she played with string bands here, with Luther Davis and other people in the string bands, and these were loud enough that you could play them like a banjo.
Yeah, you could play it with a banjo, play it with a banjo, a fiddle, and 2 guitars, and you could still hear it.
Yeah.
And I used to sit in a campsite in a jam session, and people could find our campsite because they could hear my dulcimer. It was pretty cool.
That's sort of unexpected for people who know about dulcimers.
Yeah. Now, I have up here the one on the far left. Suzanne, if you want to touch that one, your left. That
hold it up.
Yeah. That one was made by Roscoe Russell, and Roscoe Russell married Raymond Melton's sister. So it's still in the family, you see. And he changed his design just like other dulcimer players do, dulcimer makers, and put his stamp on it. Yeah. Yeah. And then this one right here that Suzanne's going to hold up for us is one that I made with my friend Tom Scanlon, and we copied one of Jacob Ray Melton's dulcimers. And we put the frets all the way across. So that's one we made. And then this one I showed you was Jacob Ray's. Now, the reason I wanted to point out the Roscoe Russell one again is because in this book, a man named Keith Young repaired Roscoe Russell's dulcimer that he played. It was in pieces. And so Keith Young, when he took it to his shop, took pictures of the insides. So this shows what the inside of Roscoe Russell's dulcimers look like. And I've also got, I gathered this up from friends, and the bits and pieces fell together to make a book, and this book came together from December to April. December 2011 to April 2012, it came together. This right here is a diagram that my friend Terry Burcham, who got a dulcimer from Jacob Melton, he drew a diagram of his dulcimer, much longer than mine and much thicker than mine. It's about this thick. It's quite deep. Also in here, I have this gentleman's picture. His name is Don Newhouser. Wave your hand, Don. Don fell in love with a Galax dulcimer, and he started building Galax dulcimers. And he's probably got one in the case over there. He'll be happy to show you afterwards. He's been making Galax dulcimers for a number of years. And then I have a friend, Ben Seymour in North Carolina, who's also making them. But folks, some luthier, some young guy or woman needs to start building these things because it is a dying instrument. There are very few players. I have been on a crusade for a long time to get people to play this. Inside here is the diagram of the bracing of the inside of this brown dulcimer right here. And this is an x-ray of it, of what it looks like. So bracing, here's Don Newhouser's bracing, shows you how to brace it. It gives you dimensions. Somebody please make them.
So what we need to do is to encourage people to start playing dulcimers and string bands.
Right, exactly.
And as a Galax tradition, well, some of the Galax traditions here are being lost because people don't do it anymore, and we're kind of come to a festival kind of playing, which doesn't focus on the local traditions. Kevin, now you brought a dulcimer.
Yeah.
Is it a Galax style dulcimer?
Yeah, it was made right above Audrey Hash's house up on the barrel wall.
And it's it's from White Top.
Lord and Osborne, yeah.
But it's a much later instrument.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he was really old when he made it.
That particular pattern was found by Audrey Hash wedged in between two walls of an old log cabin.
So this pattern that she uses is one that she found locally in White Top.
Yeah. The head on it is this nice gentle curve. Mm-hmm. And then there's a D handle on it.
Yep.
And this gentleman changed the D handle. It's a little more elongated than hers were. And also, the original one was about this thick. I've got one, it was about 3 inches thick. I have one that Audrey made that was also a copy of that old one. So
I think so.
it looks like it was played on the board to make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's the same idea as having the false bottom,
right,
which gives you a reflector, a resonator.
Right.
And the other question I have is that I see the really old pictures of Galax dulcimers, people are playing with a bow. When did that change?
Those were not these kind of dulcimers, though.
They were those kind of dulcimers.
Yeah,
these big ones?
There's an album that's made, and they got a picture of it, Cold Creek.
Okay. Now, they were not the.
They were shaped like this.
They're not hourglass ones.
No, they were shaped like this.
Shaped like this.
That's a Virginia style, okay? But they weren't as thick. They were like this thick, and they were bowed. Yeah.
But that bow tradition did come to the Galax area.
Yeah, or came from it. I don't know. It came.
So someplace. But that tradition was another one that's lost.
It is. That one's totally lost. Yeah. This one's not. This is still available. I mean, you could. This is one that can be saved. Yep.
Yeah, the dulcimer can be played with finger picks like a banjo, or a lot of people use a turkey quill, which is a feather with the ends cut off, like Bonnie Russell. It's swish, kind of made a different sound, and it blended real well with guitars and things, the way she played one. But there's a lot of different styles. I mean, whether it be bowed or, finger picks like a banjo, there's several different things you can do.
Exactly. So let's go, question. Good. Sure, we're really focusing on construction, but we like to hear music, I know.
You want it with the feather or with the pick?
we want it loud.
3 fingers. Yeah.
That's with the feather.
Beautiful.
And then this is with a pick. My name is Phyllis Gaskins, And I first saw Raymond Melton in the early 1970s, around 1974, 1975, maybe 76 or 77. It was somewhere along in there. And I saw him playing at fiddlers conventions, and I fell in love with the way he played the instrument, the style of his instrument. The tuning was quite different. It was loud, and I wanted to play just like him. Okay, this instrument was made by Jacob Ray Melton. He was the nephew of Raymond Melton. And it has all of the characteristics of a Melton dulcimer before there were modifications done to it. It has a false bottom, which is right here. It's a double bottom. It has the bowed shape with the bouts equal on each side. It has a fretboard tailpiece and head stock that are all out of one piece of wood. So it's like a piece of 2x4. Here's this and then this and up into the head. This was all one piece of wood, and they carved out the shape. And then they hollowed out. He hollowed this out inside, so it's a hollow fretboard. Then the sides were fitted into slots on the fretboard. And then the bottom and the top were put on, and they were trimmed down to match the bend in the sides. They didn't use heating irons. It was just the bow that created the dulcimer shape. All the old dulcimers had staple frets on them where you were supposed to note the notes, and 2 strings to drum. All of the strings are tuned to the D note right beside a middle C. This dulcimer was made for me by Raymond Melton, and I asked Raymond why he didn't put a double bottom on it, and he said because his were loud enough without it. So that's the one thing that he changed on the Melton dulcimers. His were longer. This is a much longer string vibrating length from this nut down to here. It's a longer string, so that also makes it louder. But it has all the characteristics that one has, except the double bottom. And the reason it doesn't have staple frets anymore is because I wore them out playing it, and I had it refretted. The Meltons used mechanical tuners on their dulcimers as soon as mechanical tuners were available. There are a couple down in Harmon's Museum in Galax, and they have the really early mechanical tuners in them. This dulcimer was made by Roscoe Russell. Roscoe married Raymond's sister, and he modified the dulcimer again. He changed the shape of it a bit. It's more of a teardrop shape, but it's still fairly equal in the bouts. Still maintains the double bottom, the single piece of wood, except that he put a guitar head on it. So that was his stamp on his particular dulcimers. All of these are tuned to the same note. So you got 4 Ds when they're in tune. And another thing Roscoe did was he changed the traditional sound holes. These are modern sound holes, whereas the circles and the diamonds were the traditional sound holes used on the instruments. And this is simply one that I helped build. So it's a copy, sort of a copy of the Melton. It's more of a Melton style than the others.
So let's move on to fiddles. And there's obviously fiddle music was a big thing in the Galax area. And there were fiddle makers here from the very first. And I'll just give you a very quick snippet, and then I'll let these other guys talk about fiddles because they know more about them than I do. My interest in it came from the fact that I found out that there was a Landreth from my family that made fiddles. So I started looking for a Landreth fiddle. And down at the very end of the table there, the picture of a guy with a big picture there with a saw. That's Stephen Landreth. He was born in 1877. He was actually a carpenter. He built houses, he made furniture, he made all sorts of carpentry things. But then his family, when they married, his mother was a stoneman. I think the music came to the family through the Stonemans. They played instruments. He made all of their instruments. And in the smaller picture up there is a picture of his family with his 2 daughters, Rosa and Flora. One of them, Flora's playing an autoharp, which he made. Rosa's playing a mandolin, which he made. he's playing a cello, which is here on the end of the table is that same cello that he made. And he made fiddles. The fiddle, the next one in line there was a fiddle he made. And he apparently made a lot of fiddles. And the fiddles were played by a lot of people here. Tony Alderman, who played with the Hillbillies, played a Landreth fiddle. And we haven't located it, but he made lots of fiddles. There's a picture there from his shop. When you're milling around afterwards, you'll see them hanging on the wall where they're drying after he finished them. But he was a fiddle maker around 1900, made lots of fiddles. If you look at the craftsmanship for being made in that period, they are not shabby. They're very well made. And I think that's another thing, is you think of people here out in the mountains making fiddles, they must be really kind of crude. They aren't. They're really they're pretty fine. But he made his own forms. You knew the family. Right. They were also good fiddlers. Stephen and his brother were good fiddlers. His brother was Andy, right? Andy. Both were great fiddlers who won contests. They played on WPAQ. The fiddle making was the real interesting tradition to me that was in that family. And he made everything. Made his own tools. The saw that's there, he made. All of his hand tools he made. He and his first cousin was Ernest Stoneman. He and Ernest Stoneman, Pop Stoneman, would go out in the woods when Stonemans lived here, look for wood, and they would both make instruments. So if you talk to some of the Stoneman kids, they'll tell you that when we needed an instrument, Daddy made it. Well, he and Stephen Landreth made them together in Stephen Landreth's shop is where they made their instruments. So a lot of those handmade instruments come from there. So it's really interesting, and it's also interesting that it's not the thing that we think of as an old-time band. Here we are in 1910, or maybe a little earlier, about 1905, in that picture that's on the bench. And it's not a clawhammer banjo and a fiddle and a guitar. He's playing cello. And I have other pictures of him. He's playing horns with the kids playing auto harp and stuff. So the bands weren't, we've sort of simplified the band to something that's really not accurate. There was a lot more diversity in the kinds of music that was played here and the kinds of instruments that were built here. But that's just some examples there. And I don't want to leave time for these guys to talk. The one thing I do want to tell you is that when I started researching his instrument building, I discovered that, because I was stunned that he made auto harps, and we're really lucky that the family, one of the children of Stephen Landreth was interviewed when she was still alive by Alice Gerard, and that tape is in the Chapel Hill in their library. And I was able to get that. So Alice was able to talk to Rosa before she died. And some of you may have seen Rosa. If you've been going to the Fiddlers Convention for a long time, this is Stephen Landreth's daughter, who used to come to the Fiddlers Conventions. Rosa Landreth, she became very well known on auto harp because Mike Fenton, who used to come here and do a lot of auto harp things, sort of featured her in a lot of his books and his magazines and things. So she was an auto harp player here, and she was the one who was interviewed. She's now deceased, about her father, and she was able to tell people a lot about what they did and how the instruments were made, which is absolutely wonderful. But she always said that the auto harps that her dad made were better than then her brown auto harps that her dad made were better than the black auto harps she got out of the Sears Roebuck catalog. So they made auto harps, but yes, ma'am. That's Virgil Cox. That's her. She is Rosa Cox, and that's her husband, Virgil Cox. Okay. So, and he worked in the glass factories. But that's another story. The interesting thing was when I started asking about him, I found out that not just he made auto harps, which was weird enough, but the farm on either side of him, the people made auto harps. Stephen Landreth also wrote songs. What he did basically was write a song about his next door neighbor who made auto harps and how bad they were. So it wasn't just that he made auto harps. He was competitive with the guy next door and wrote songs about how he made these awful auto harps that sounded like a whang and were made black with stove black, and how awful they were. So you need to look at the lyrics of that song. But that was a really funny part of trying to do some research about this family.
I'm Ken Landreth, and I've always been interested in the instruments as well as the music of this area. And when I realized that there was someone who was my namesake, Stephen Landreth, who made fiddles, I started looking for a Landreth fiddle. And that led me to eventually finding a Landreth fiddle, which led me to looking for more information about Stephen Landreth and meeting the family. So once I met the family, things sort of mushroomed from there. And I got more and more interested in Stephen Landreth as a maker and in Stephen Landreth's life my connection to him, and the family history, and out of that, we have the history of the instruments as much as we know at this point. The main thing that Stephen Landreth made were fiddles, and he made them completely. These were made somewhere around 1900 to 1935. This fiddle is about a 1930 fiddle. The wood is all local wood. Stephen Landreth was a first cousin to Ernest Stoneman, and he and Ernest Stoneman would go into the woods on Iron Ridge, which is just north of Galax, and look for wood, and then use the best wood they could find to make the instruments. So this is all maple and spruce from around New River, because they both lived right on the New River. Interestingly, he used walnut for the fingerboards and then painted them black, so it looked like the instruments that other people made, that factories made. But it's all handmade and all done with hand tools that were made by Stephen Landreth. One of the interesting things is that when I started finding pictures of Stephen Landreth by talking to the family, I found that pictures of him playing a cello and of his kids playing a cello. So I got interested in where was this cello. And this cello was found in the attic of one of the homes of one of the grandchildren. It was tied to the rafters by a piece of fodder twine and had been hanging there for years. So this cello, which is in the pictures we have of Stephen Landreth, was built somewhere around 1900. We have no idea where he got the form or the idea to do this, but that they played in the home cello with their string band music and with wind instruments as part of the music that was played in the home. As I learned more about Stephen Landreth, I found that he made all sorts of instruments. He made them as they needed them, and at some point they decided they needed guitars. So he made a few guitars. This is a guitar made by Stephen Landreth about 1930, and the interesting thing about the guitar, and other than the fact that it looks like the factory guitars of that day, like a Gibson guitar, is that the entire instrument is made like a fiddle. So if you look at the construction of the instrument, the woods are like a fiddle. The construction of the instrument's like a fiddle. The way the back and the front are applied is like a fiddle. So he basically made a fiddle into a guitar. So this is a guitar made by Stephen Landreth, all from local woods. The pickguard is made out of poplar, dyed black. Many of the metal parts are made from galvanized tin to look like ones that were made by factories. And basically he only bought the tailpiece, and the bridge was about all he bought as factory parts to make the guitar. Kevin, you want to tell us about the fiddles that you brought?
Well, the first fiddle builder I was ever around was Whit Sizemore. We'd try to go over and visit him every Christmas and spend several hours. And one Christmas I was over there, and he said, "Come back here to the bedroom, I want to show you something." And he had a pair of fiddles made by Dr. W.P. Davis of the Bog Trotters. And he was also the one that had the idea to have the Galax Fiddlers Convention. And Whit showed me the fiddles and told me all about them. And Whit was named after Dr. Whitfield Davis. And then he said, "Come on, let's go down to the basement." He said, "Let me show you my fiddle building stuff." So he carried me down there and showed me all about how he made the fiddles and everything. It's real neat. And then he passed, and a year or so later, his wife called and said, "Are you interested in his tools?" I said, "Yeah." So we went over, and I got all of his tools, well, most of his tools, and I found an old fiddle laying over an old cannon shelf, and I asked her, I said, "What do you want to do with this?" "Well, you can just carry it with you if you want it." The neck was busted out of it. Looked in there, and Whit made it in 1967. So I carried it back home, put it back together, and we found out that the pair of fiddles that Dr. Davis had made was going to be at an auction on New Year's Day at Fairview. So we bid it on them, and we got them, and he made them in 1934, Dr. Davis did. We was really tickled to get those. And
So he was building fiddles about the same time as Stephen Landreth was building
Mhm.
fiddles.
they're
Do you have
really-
any idea where he learned to make fiddles?
No, I guess doctor know people.
That's the interesting thing is these violins are so well made. We're curious how these people learn to do this. And I know that Tom, you work with some of the people on White Top, and you still make fiddles and learn from the people up there. How did they? Do you have any idea how they learned to do this?
No, it's been a mystery to me on that part. After I worked with Albert Hash for probably played music with him for about 15 years, I went to Italy in 1986, and I run across some fiddle makers over there, and it was amazing. They was doing exactly the same thing Albert was doing. Albert never been out of White Top, at that time, so I don't know where he learned. He was somebody coming through the country, I guess, but. Of course, Albert Hash, he was a different, he was an artist. I mean, it just, nobody else that I've ever seen could come up to do the kind of work that Albert done in his inlay, the carving of different sculpture on the back of his fiddles. And he was just, a lot of fiddle makers or violin makers from bigger cities would come to Albert's house to try to learn some things that he was doing. And here he lived in the mountains and teaching some of the people from the big cities, show it. But Albert had no secrets. He would tell you everything if you asked him something. I mean, a lot of people that makes instruments, they have a little secret this, secret that, but Albert was straight up to everybody.
Albert studied books. He went to the library and he got books on how to make fiddles. And he studied those and he decided that he could make one. And he said, all you do is you cut away everything that doesn't look like a fiddle.
That's what it said.
And he made it by hand. He used a pocket knife for his first ones. And he built tools to shape his violins with. He made the tools that he used.
He was a machinist.
He was a machinist, yeah.
So he's very much like the Stephen Landreth
Exactly,
who made all these tools.
exactly. Yeah.
And we know the question for you is that we know of one. It's a funny story because Mary and I came down here to an auction because they advertised an unfinished Melton fiddle. And Kenneth was at that auction that day, and I came just searching for where's this unfinished Melton fiddle. I'd never seen a Melton fiddle. And it turned out to be just a back, an unfinished piece of curly maple shaped like a back. Barely started. So we have a little bit of evidence that the Meltons made fiddles. Do we know anything about Melton fiddles?
I don't.
Something else we need to know about.
I never heard of that.
So we have the first nugget. We have a piece of wood that looks like a fiddle that's seriously unfinished.
Well, actually, the way I started making instruments, Albert said, well, if you carve stone, you could make a fiddle. This was in 1972. So I said, well, I've never worked in wood much. I've always worked in stone. And he said, well, it's easier to carve wood than it is stone. So I started making a fiddle. It took me a year to make my first fiddle. And he said, well, you're going to have to continue, start another fiddle before you get through with that, or you won't make any more. So I went ahead and got into making another fiddle, and I kept on. So I only made about 65 fiddles. But anyhow, after Albert passed away in '83, the last stone I fixed was it's up there, he's buried at Hall Orchard. I put this fiddle on there. This was the last carving I'd done, and I even wrote this verse on the stone and everything, and the family said I could do this. So, and I took it up there, and would you care to read the verse on that?
Sure. It says, a husband, father, friend, and neighbor, Albert made and played fiddles for over 55 years. If the wind on White Top Mountain sounds vaguely like fiddle music, it's most likely the mountain's way of paying tribute to a good country gentleman.
And that was, anyhow, that was the way Albert was. And, anyhow, that's why, how I got into music, and that's why I'm still in it. Yeah, it becomes a way of life.
Okay, so I want to move on to banjos. And Kevin, again, you and Tom are the banjo experts. Both of you Tom actually worked with Kyle Creed. So maybe we get Tom to start talking about Kyle, and then we'll get Kevin to clean that up?
Well, when I first met Kyle, he was a wagon master, and we'd do wagon trains, and we'd go out and play music, different stops on the wagon trains. And so Kyle, he was playing the banjo. Then he said he wanted to start playing fiddle, so he got Tom Milett to play the banjo, and he started playing fiddle. But he was off key. The fiddle, a standard size fiddle, was a little bit too long for him, and he couldn't stay on key too good. So I made him a fiddle, and I took soot out of a stovepipe to turn it real dark in the finish. And anyhow, that's how I got acquainted with Kyle, playing wagon trains. And
How did Kyle get started playing, making banjos?
well, he made next, him and Hurley Bryant, they lived up there close to each other. After Kyle come back from Richmond, he had this little store building up there, and Hurley lived right down the road. And Hurley would take sand and sculpture sand and taking milk aluminum or milk brass and stuff and pour it in this sand in the ground and make bluegrass tone rings. So Kyle kind of got, he usually made he'd make necks. He'd buy banjo pots, and then he started making the pots too. But that's probably one of Hurley. Was that Hurley?
Yeah, it's both his and Kyle's,
Yeah.
and it's got a sterling silver tone ring that they melted their eating utensils. And Whit Sizemore told me that story, that they was out standing casting that tone ring one night, and they melted all of the sterling silver stuff they had, and they didn't have enough to pour the tone ring, so they went to the neighbor's house to ask for their sterling silver eating utensils. So they finally got enough.
So this is the way Grayson County and Carroll County, Galax area instrument makers did things. I can figure out a way to do this.
Hurley run a barbershop just down on the left on Main Street. Charles Hawks and Beverly Davis, Dr. Davis's son, they all cut hair in the same barbershop down there. And, but they was all involved in music. It's just kind of way of life. But but that's kind of, I think, how Kyle got into it. He was a carpenter. He had built a lot of houses and things and buildings in Richmond. And anyhow, he called me one day and he wanted to go back to Richmond and look at the buildings he had built. So he said he couldn't drive, so I drove him and Purse to Richmond, and we stayed there 2 days. And we went all over Richmond. He was showing me buildings he had built. And we got back on Monday, and Thursday, Purse called me, and when we went up there, and he died the next day. But he got to go and see all his buildings. But I think he was actually a good carpenter and everything. That's how he got into musical making,
So basically, he was the same story. He was a carpenter. He had woodworking skills. He played music, and he did an instrument, so he started building his own instruments.
And he built his first banjo when he was 15, when he was curing a barn and tobacco with, I think, his uncle John Lowe, I think.
So Kyle Creed is the famous banjo builder here, that now the banjos are going for astronomical prices that I can't believe. Kevin has not only plays like Kyle, he also builds instruments like Kyle, and he's been researching, as Phyllis has done with the dulcimers, he's been researching those instruments. So tell us something about the Kyle Creed banjos and why they're so different.
Well, so far in research, I've located 118 of his banjos and measured and documented.
And how many of the ones back here behind us are Kyle's?
3.
The first two and then the fourth one?
Yeah.
Okay, those are all Kyle's.
And he was a really unique builder. This one banjo, he was known for using formica on the fingerboards, all over the banjo. And he built that neck for Tom Norman, which Tom played the banjo left-handed upside down, they called it. And on that banjo, he put the fifth peg in the middle of the peg head. That was in early 60s.
So it has a hole in the middle of the peg head here.
But sometime or another, Tom broke a string off in it, and I couldn't get the formica off where it was glued down so tight. But that was...
So it was originally built with that middle one because he played it upside down.
Yes. So the fifth peg...
Another invention for what he had to do.
Yeah. And
So what about the construction, the placement of the bridge?
The rim is mine. I had to put the rim. Tom Norman gave me the neck.
When Kyle Creek built banjos, why is the bridge always up so far on the banjo?
He came up with a formula to shorten the scale of the banjo, and because I got a recording of him, somebody's interviewing him, and he said he remembered when he was younger going with his daddy to dances and stuff, people's house. Said them old timers, they had the bridge closer to the center of the head. But they was playing fretless homemade banjos anyways. But he wanted to come up, and they sounded good. He wanted to come up with some kind of formula to shorten the scale to pull the bridge closer to the center. So he
And some of those old banjos also had copper, not
Yeah.
brass, but copper up here that they slid their fingers on with no frets.
Yeah,
So his use of Formica was also to slide good.
yeah. And he was a really unique person for what I know. He grew up with all my family down below the mountain, right around Beulah and Low Gap and around Peak.
How many banjos did he make?
You said that you finished the last 6 or 7, maybe?
6 of them. We had just about finished when
Yeah,
his wife had done got paid. She wanted to, so I went up there and put them together.
yeah. I think the last number was 198, but the other day I was going through my paperwork and I found 2 number 156s. He didn't start numbering until 1975 when he put the number. Didn't he have something like
Yeah,
that?
he had a little stamp.
Hay binder.
Well, he had a stamp. He used green ink, and he started turning the numbers instead of. And that's the only log he had was he had this little roller thing.
Yeah.
Every time he'd make one, he'd stamp inside the pot. Another banjo, But
So if he forgot to roll it,
if he forgot to roll, or if he rolled one extra, but the amazing thing, he'd work for a month or so, and he sold them banjos for a couple $100. And same way with Albert Hash and fiddles and all that, a couple $100 or $250 tops that they could get out of anything. He'd work, 2 or 3 months, so he had to be doing other work in order to live. It was kind of a hobby for everybody as well as.
well, back at the end, sort of the end of Kyle's making banjos, I remember he was selling for $300, and that was sort of the top price he ever got for one. Now, you'd probably be lucky to get one for $3,000.
$3,000.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good deal.
Now that
Yeah, it's a good deal. So
the aluminum pot, it's on that other table over there. That was a form that Kyle made to roll the wood. What you done, you cut maple 1/4 inch thick, and it would be about 38 inches long, and you'd boil it in water, in a trough of water, for about 30, 40 minutes. Then you'd roll it around this form and use clamps, and you put it in the oven in the house for about 45 minutes at low heat, and when it's dry, then you would laminate everything together, and that's how you made your pots. Now,
so that was a form he made pots on.
that's one of his forms. I got 2 of them, and that was his original form that they had made also. Now, these other things, the flat things, that's brass. The other one, the 2, what you done, the one with the notches. Yeah, what you done, you took a rod of brass and you used a rolling machine where they make duck pipes and things, like stovepipe, and you would roll and make a ring like that. That's a 1/2 inch by 1/8 thick brass rod, or piece of brass, and then you would braze them together, and then you'd saw it on a table saw upside down. You'd make all these notches. Then you'd take a chainsaw file, you would file them, and when you got all that done, cleaned up, then you would take them to get them nickel plated. And the last one I had nickel plated was $80 to get it nickel plated, and not counting all your week's work just making a tension hook, and you could buy them for $35. So what the problem was, back then was 12 inch. Nowhere in the country could you buy a 12-inch banjo or anything. At the time Kyle was making 12-inch banjos, he was the only person in the United States making 12-inch banjos.
So there were 2 problems. One is the availability, and the other is people in this area just said, "Damn it, I can do this better than they can. I'm not buying it anywhere."
Now the round thing, that's a welding rod. You buy a welding rod, it was 1/4 inch, or you can buy 3/8, and you do the rolling machine, you roll them, brace them together, and then that becomes a tone ring, especially for old-time banjos. They use a welding rod. That's all you need. It's solid brass and all. But you had to make everything. I mean, you had to go out and cut your wood, and then you had to cure it so long. And see, in cutting wood, Kyle, he wanted apple. That was his favorite thing to use. If he seen an apple tree, he'd stop and try to buy it. In fact, I give him a couple trees myself, but apple was real stable. And he could take that apple wood and he'd cure it, and it was so stable that people don't use it nowadays, but you just don't see many apple trees.
So was it apple or cherry that he found up on the Blue Ridge Parkway?
Probably apple, but that's what.
On the rail.
Was it apple?
No, it was cherry.
It was cherry. I thought it was cherry. So tell him that story. This is Kyle Creed at his finest.
Well, somebody was wanting him to build a banjo, and the best I can recall, Tom might can tell it better, but he was wanting to find a piece of cherry wood to build the neck out of. So he got to thinking, and he went down on the parkway to the split rail fence. He got his pocket knife out, started going up to the rails to see till he found a cherry. So he took that split rail with him.
So he's stolen a split rail off of the parkway now.
He carried it and fixed it for a neck and everything, and then he went to a sawmill and cut a split rail and carried it and put it back, replaced it.
So that was quintessential Kyle Creed.
Another thing, his late brother-in-law told me, Marlon Hicks, he worked at Proctor Silex in Mount Airy where they made toasters. And Kyle would bring him a bunch of brass parts, that's like back in the 60s, that he had made, attention hoops and coordinator rods and tone rings. And he'd carry them to Proctor's and chrome plate them, dip them in the chrome vats. Then he'd bring them back to him.
That's how I got, I was playing music some with Kyle and got into making banjos. I just kept making banjos. I made about 212 banjos now. And of course, back now, when I make a banjo now, I get $2,500 out of one. Back then, when I made a banjo, I got $200 out of it. So, it's a different world now, but it's still not. You have a lot of time in making instruments. You have to do your wood. I mean, it's just so many things, and you can do everything right and do one thing wrong, and you've done lost all your. I've got more scrap instruments that I didn't get fixed right in my shop than I've ever made. I mean, I got pieces of instruments everywhere because they didn't suit. If it don't suit me, I can't sell them to somebody else. So that's the way it goes. And I don't even own an instrument. Actually, when I make a musical instrument, it's mine until somebody will tell me they're going to play it. I just don't like to waste my time and life making an instrument to be hung on the wall. If they're not going to play it and enjoy it, I'll let somebody that will play it and enjoy it. And that's the way Albert felt also. He wanted his instruments to be played where people could enjoy it and let other people enjoy it too. I think all musical instrument makers wants their musical instruments to be played because it becomes a big part of your life.
I'm Kevin Fore. I grew up down the mountain in Low Gap, North Carolina, and in 2011, me and my wife Trish moved up on the mountain, the Galax right off the parkway near the Blue Ridge Music Center, and about a mile from Kyle Creed's old place. This banjo I found, there was an old man in Mount Airy. Me and my daddy done his heating and air work, and he had passed away, and my daddy told me there was a yard sale at his house, and there was 2 banjos there. So I went to the yard sale and I bought the 2 banjos that was laying on the table, and they told me to go around the property and see if I seen anything I was interested in. And so I went around behind the old barn and I seen a pile of old lawnmower engines just sitting there. And and I seen something sticking out of the engines, and I went and got a little closer. I said, that looks like an instrument neck. And I pulled back a couple of lawnmower engines, and I pulled out this banjo. Made probably sometime in the 1800s or early 1900s, and it's all homemade, and it's got pokeberry stain. And the rim is made out of the top of an old nail keg. And it had a skin hide on it sometime or another, and it had to be tied somehow and to the back to get the right tension. And they played it so much, they grooved the wood out so much, they just nailed a steel plate there so they could keep on playing the banjo. This is the kind of instruments they, if they wanted to play music, this is what they had to do because they couldn't afford anything. Yeah, this banjo was made by a local, it was a pretty famous family from the area, the Richardsons. The man's name that built it was Claude Richardson, and he was the father of Larry Richardson, a really famous bluegrass banjo player from the area. Played with Bill Monroe and several other bands. And his daddy got into building resonator-style banjos when his son was come along playing. And this banjo come from my friend Lucas Paisley. He brought it to me a few years ago to get some work done on it, and he said he didn't know none of the history behind it, but his late friend left it to him. Her name was Faye Wagner from Allegheny County. And I carried it home and took it apart, and I could make out a few letters of the name, and I could tell it was a Richardson. And I called Cullen Gallion's wife, Betty, and I asked her, I said, I think Claude was her uncle. And I said, Betty, I said, did Claude Richardson build banjos? She said, why, yes, honey, they did. He did. And I said, well, I think I got one here, one of my friends that I'm working on. And she said, yeah, he built several banjos. And this one's real unique. The resonator, the whole resonator is turned on a lathe out of one piece of wood. That's something you don't see nowadays. And he built the banjos about in the style of Kyle Creed and Pearlie Bryant. This banjo was built sometime in the early to mid-60s by Kyle Creed and Pearlie Bryant. And Pearlie was uncle to Bobby Patterson. And the rim is a block rim, and it's made out of walnut, the rim is, and the neck is maple. And the most unique thing about it is the tone ring. Pearlie was known in the area for sand casting flathead tone rings for banjos. And most of the time he used brass or aluminum or some kind of other soft metals. But this one is sterling silver. And we got the banjo from Whit Sizemore, and he told us the story about them sand casting the tone ring one night. Said they got all of their eating utensils they had that was sterling silver, and they was melting them down to make a tone ring. And they was out in the backyard of doing it, and they noticed they wasn't going to have enough metal, the silver, to finish the casting. So they went around to the neighbor's house and got their sterling silver eating utensils to melt down to finish casting the tone ring. So it's got a little story behind it.
So what we've got are now instruments. We've got the dulcimers, we've got banjos, we've got fiddles. People also made mandolins. They made cello, obviously. They made all kinds of instruments. Anything they needed, they made. They made it out of the things they could find around themselves, spoons to make a tone ring, whatever they could find. And even when they were available commercially, they went ahead and made them themselves because that's just the way it was. And that tradition has now continued. Tom still makes fiddles and banjos, makes them himself. He does, even though you could probably buy one cheaper. Kevin makes banjos, same thing. Wayne Henderson, Jimmy Edmonds, all of them are making instruments that are really great, and they're better than anything you can buy. But that's the thing is they're doing it because they think they can do it better and they want to do it better. So there's this pride in the craftsmanship here that you really don't find in some communities, and it's really important.